Hold on to your seat, cheeks. It was a wild week 2 in the college football world. We'll recap and put together a week 3 watch guide.
All my blessings, 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 all my blessings.
I need my blessings every penny, daily counting every single one, I'm seeing plenty. Level up and watch that.
Saturday we had with number 6, number 8, number 9, number 12, number 17, number 19, number 25, all going down. 7 ranked teams, 3 of them in the top 10. Starting with the headliner, Alabama surviving Texas 20-19 on a late field goal after Bryce Young put a game-winning drive together that involved him dodging what looked like a surefire sack and scrambling for 25 yards to help set up the game-winning field goal. Now, Quentin Ewers was able to move the ball, but he was cracked in the second quarter, has a busted clavicle, and he'll be out 4 to 6 weeks. So Hudson Carr came in and finished out the game. He lost the starting quarterback battle last year and this year, but looks like he will be the starter for the next month and a half at this point. Now, he didn't look great. Quentin Ewers clearly the better quarterback from what little we've seen so far. Alabama looked pretty damn horrific in this game. 15 penalties, I believe, tied the most for a Nick Saban coach squad. They were not effective in the trenches on either side of the ball. Jahmyr Gibbs actually led the team in receiving yards and receptions, and he's the starting running back to transfer out of Georgia Tech. But the offensive line looked terrible against University of Texas's defensive front that had, complaints that there was no pass rush and that they couldn't get the job done, but the offensive line for Alabama had troubles there. And this Texas team, if you remember, gave up almost 500 yards of offense per game last season. So that was really shocking to see this Alabama team not be able to move the ball at all at times against Texas. But wow, was it sure great to see them get on the right page there. On the other side of the ball, 2 true freshmen, a couple sophomores on the offensive line for Texas, and that front for Alabama not able to get in there very often on those young guys. So those recruits starting to look pretty good for Texas, finally starting to pan out. Steve Sarkisian starting to look pretty wise, pretty smart there. Now, Gary Patterson was fired from TCU, long tenured there, obviously, and he consults now with the University of Texas on the defensive side of the ball. So maybe he's got some kind of infusion of great strategy and talent on that side. Maybe that's part of it. Bijan Robinson was held to 57 yards on 21 carries. He did have 73 yards on 3 receptions on the offensive side for Texas. Xavier Robinson was great as well. Now, Alabama beat Utah State last week, only of note because they won the Mountain West last year. Utah State did. But the Aggies turned around and lost to Weber State last Saturday as well, 35-7. So they're not looking as sharp now. So it kind of brings into question that first victory that Alabama had in opening week now, since Utah State, their first opponent, is looking so poor now as well. So Alabama really has to figure some things out, and Texas has now jumped into the top 25 after looking really, really good in a loss in a game that they probably could have won. And Hudson Carr, for the future here for at least half a season, probably will be the starting quarterback. We'll see if that's actually a problem, because he is not looking quite as efficient as Ewers did, even though he only played about 5.5 quarters so far this season. Now, Texas A&M and Notre Dame's offenses looked horrific. The Irish against Ohio State, and Texas A&M had some question marks bubble up against Sam Houston State. Those are their openers, but the issues really came to fruition this past Saturday. Notre Dame is now 0-2 after falling to Marshall 26-21 at home. The game was 12-7 heading into the fourth quarter and 26-15 before Notre Dame scored a late touchdown to keep it from being a complete embarrassment. Tyler Buchner had 2 picks, and Dwayne Payne came off the bench and threw one as well. Marshall didn't even turn the ball over. They were really efficient on both sides. The yardage was comparable, but this really looked like Marshall was the better team pretty much all the way through. But both teams were 4 of 13 on third down, And just really a tough go for Notre Dame here. Cal at North Carolina and BYU are next for this Irish team that really needs to figure it out, because right now it doesn't even look like there's 6 wins on the schedule for a makeable bowl game right now. And it was just announced that Buchner has an injury and will be out for the next 4 months due to a shoulder injury on his non-throwing side. So Drew Payne, the junior, will now be starting for the Irish. Appalachian State won on the road over number 6 Texas A&M in a game where they had twice as many first downs, twice as many third down conversions, twice as much time of possession, fewer turnovers, fewer penalties, and limited Texas A&M's offense to less than 200 yards, and kind of a new kind of blowout, a 17-14 slow death as the Aggies couldn't tie it up on a missed field goal with less than 4 minutes remaining, and Appalachian State was really just the better team through and through. Now, Jimbo Fisher's been accused of not really updating his offense and kind of playing a little bit more up-tempo and really switching things around for a long time now. It's the same thing Nick Saban was accused of in the mid-2010s until he started to open up the offense, play with a little tempo, move the quarterback around, and he's vowed to make changes, but Jimbo Fisher just hasn't shown them yet this season. And the schedule for A&M is brutal. Miami, Arkansas, at Mississippi State, at Alabama, all in the next month, so it could get out of control very quickly if Jimbo Fisher cannot kind of get it together here. Probably have a little bit less heat on him because he does have that national championship on his belt from his Florida State days, and he continues to bring in big recruits. But if he can't really be a big player on the national stage, let alone just the SEC, then he could be in real trouble. We could see a lot of Texas Tech kids in the transfer portal, and it could be lots of problems here. Now, the social media post of the Appalachian State campus and all the kids running the streets and partying was pretty sweet. And after the near victory at North Carolina last week, this was just a huge win for them. Baylor fell in double overtime on the road at BYU, a team that claimed Utah early last season. Both teams figured to stay in the top 20 probably the rest of the year. BYU had a couple receivers missing, was 3 for 14 on third down, lost the time of possession battle, and both teams really struggled to get the ground game going, but Baylor's 14 penalties really offset their 50% third down conversion rate in this game. That was a little bit of a slog at times as expected, but BYU's schedule looked brutal coming into this season, and after a big win here in double overtime, it looks maybe a little bit more doable for a run here to a possible playoff appearance. Oregon, Notre Dame, Utah State, Boise State, and Stanford all suffered humbling losses already 2 weeks into the year. So it's looking a little bit better for BYU after a big win here over the Baylor Bears. Now, Florida and Kentucky, I haven't got a chance to review much or watch a second of, really. I was at the Michigan game. But Florida had a real opportunity to shoot up in the rankings even further after hopping in at number 12, knocking off Utah last week. But the bummer side of the young quarterback here, Anthony Richardson, came out, and he couldn't move the ball at all against the Wildcats. 40% completion percentage, 143 yards, 2 picks, only 4 yards on the ground on 6 carries. That was a little bit to be expected. He's not someone that was just going to come out and light up this defense. And I think, this was absolutely an opportunity for him to come out and fail. Now, Kentucky wasn't much better. I'm not excited to kind of go back and observe much of this game, but this was, from the clips I saw, just an absolute slog. Willis Levy on the other side for Kentucky had problems as well. This is a great defensive team in Florida, and they absolutely shut down the other side as well. Now, it was an 3.8 quarterback rating for Anthony Richardson as that whole offense suffered. But the teams combined overall were 8 out of 29 on third down and at a combined 550 yards of total offense. But Kentucky gets the big win there in the Swamp. And again, theoretically behind Georgia, assuming Georgia isn't challenged, we have Tennessee, Kentucky, and Florida all fighting for kind of second place in the SEC East Division there. So it's a big win for Kentucky on the road over Florida. And of course, there'll be questions coming up. Can any of those teams hop Georgia and win that division? Now, Pittsburgh held off West Virginia last week and succumbed to Tennessee this week as they open with 2 Power 5 opponents on the schedule. It was an overtime game that finished 34-27. Kendon Slavish. It's one day I'll get that right. He was lost in the first half, and backup quarterback Nick Patty. There we go. The old Patty Cakes was banged up in the second half, but still finished the game. Now, Tennessee's defense is getting railed on appropriately the past couple of seasons, but this day, 16 quarterback hurries, and they couldn't get a sack last week against Ball State, but they managed 4 against Pittsburgh as they continue to work that side of the ball. The offense struggled a little bit, but the defensive side showing that they could win with offense last week, defense this week. Maybe things are starting to come together there in Vols country. Now, on the other side of the ball, Pittsburgh has given up 9 sacks in 2 weeks, so maybe it's not surprising that the quarterbacks over there can't stay upright. They did grab 3 on the other side here today, and 1 quarterback hurrying what's supposed to be a dominant defense, so maybe things are starting to go a little sideways there for Pittsburgh. But again, 2 tough opponents right off the rip, and we'll go through why that's kind of important here in just a moment as well, as I try to give you a little bit more updated top 25 in my eyes. Now, it'll get a little bit easier in the next couple weeks here for Pittsburgh. They'll hit Western and Rhode Island before playing struggling Georgia Tech and Virginia Tech in conference play. So they're arguably through one of the tougher stretches in their schedule, and they'll have an opportunity here to rebound the next month or so. Next, I would like to tackle the Big Ten as a complete conference here. I had in my notes originally that the Big Ten just doesn't look good, but now I'm just not entirely sure what to make of the Big Ten. So you can't really judge Michigan after Colorado State and Hawaii, but I guess those games were never in doubt. They comfortably blew them out, as they should have. But there's a difference between good teams, great teams, middling teams that'll actually make bowl games, and then Colorado State and Hawaii at the moment, and UConn, who's upcoming for Michigan on the schedule. Right? There are teams that should go about 6-6 and hopefully make a bowl game, but I'm not sure Hawaii, Colorado State, and UConn will win 6 games combined. So that's just the level of opponent that Michigan's got on the slate right now. Ohio State struggled against what looks like a pathetic Notre Dame team right now and beat Arkansas State 45-12, but didn't force any turnovers in that Arkansas State game. Had 9 penalties, still allowed 12 first downs, 4 field goals, still allowed them to move the ball a bit. Gave up 37 minutes of possession time to the Red Wolves, who, again, were able to move the ball. You can say, well, Ohio State scored a lot, and the Red Wolves didn't, so maybe they had the ball a little bit more, but still a little bit questionable there as they try to shake things up a little bit on the Ohio State defense there. Michigan State rolled up 260 yards and 6 touchdowns on the ground against Akron, but Peyton Thorne had a couple picks and through 2 games, and 3 underwhelming quarters in the first game against Western Michigan. Michigan State is just not that impressive against inferior competition. Akron might be one of the worst teams alongside who Michigan's playing in the entire FCS level. Now, Penn State's offense came alive when they splattered Ohio this week, but the Purdue game was a rough go in the first outlet, even though that was a road game, and they put together a great drive to win the game. That being said, everyone in the East Division is 2-0, and that includes Rutgers and Indiana. On the other hand, the only undefeated team in the West is Minnesota. Nebraska fired Scott Frost Sunday rather than wait 2 weeks when his buyout is cut in half on October 1st and ate an additional $7.5 million rather than see him take the field against Oklahoma and Indiana before that October 1st date came. Now they have an intern coach, which may improve team morale. Mickey Joseph is the first black coach ever at Nebraska in any sport, although he holds the intern tag. But perhaps just an absence of Scott Frost will make that team a little bit more competitive. Maybe there'll be some better decision-making. Maybe it'll be just a better look for that squad. Iowa missed a field goal against Iowa State and fell 10-7 in a game with 6 combined turnovers. The Hawkeyes have 316 yards of offense through 2 games. Wisconsin welcomed in Washington State from across the country and lost 17-14 in Cameron Ward's first big game over a Power 5 school. He's a quarterback for the Cougars and transferred in from Incarnate Word. I'm not sure how this played out exactly, but the Badgers did have 11 penalties, but twice as many first downs and 50% conversion rate on third down. The Cougars still managed to hit enough passing plays to pull the big upset here. Now, what's really sad is Graham Mertz had 227 yards and 2 touchdowns. The struggling quarterback for Wisconsin has been the lightning rod for a lot of criticism for this team. He had only 2 games last season where he threw multiple touchdowns and only 3 with over 200 yards. It's too bad he hit both marks here in a loss for the Badgers. It would be easy to say West bad, East good, but at this point, I'm just not sure. Results are still out. Now, one other thing I want to note, Kansas beat West Virginia to move to 2-0. The Jayhawks riding high, while JT Daniel and the Mountaineers are 0-2 after a promising start against Tennessee last week. Now, the Big 12 overall is 16-4, 16-3 out of conference play, because this was obviously a Big 12 conference game. But that's a great look and a great start so far for the Big 12 that may not really have a bad team in the conference, all things considered. So again, 16-3 out of conference play record for the Big 12 at this point. And really, some of the bottom teams from major Power 5 conferences haven't been doing too bad. Vanderbilt is now 2-1. Rutgers is 2-0. Those are some of the bottoming teams that I tend to think of. Stanford still not looking so great. Oregon State's looking well. So we'll have to see if those teams still end up near the bottom. It's kind of looking like we won't have any one-loss teams, at least this year. Maybe everyone will have 2 or maybe 3. Arizona already has a nice win under their belt and looks strong enough to win a couple more. So let's go bottom Power 5 teams, I guess. So the new AP Top 25 has 8 SEC teams ranked. Georgia moved up to number 1. Alabama moved down a spot to number 2 after the Texas performance. Ohio State is number 3. Michigan is number 4. Clemson is number 5. Nothing has changed there. Oklahoma is 6. USC is number 7, Oklahoma State is 8, Kentucky is 9, and Arkansas is number 10 to round out that top 10 spot. Now, Kentucky moved up 11 slots after knocking off Florida. Arkansas moved up 6 spots. Oklahoma State and USC are both up 3. Now, to round out the rest of the top 25 here, Michigan State has slid up into the 11th spot. BYU moved up 9 spots. They're now ranked 12th. Miami is 13. Utah is 14, so they're back within shouting distance of where they were before as they're slowly trying to creep back into the top 10. Tennessee moved up 9 spots to number 15. NC State is 16, followed by Baylor and Florida, who both took drops out of the top 12 there, followed by Wake Forest, Ole Miss, Texas, Penn State, Pittsburgh, Texas A&M, who fell 18 spots, and Oregon, who's back in the polls. Now, the AP poll sometimes really bugs me in how they calculate things, so I broke down a number of different categories for teams that are currently in there so that I can criticize it and put my own top 25 together here. So we have a couple of 1-1 teams with at least one solid win in Florida and Pittsburgh. We have teams that have lost to another good quality team. That's Texas, Baylor, and Utah. We have the undefeated squads that have solid wins in Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, Oklahoma State, Kentucky, Arkansas, BYU, Tennessee, and Penn State. We have squads that look really good and running over inferior opponents right now in Michigan, Clemson, Oklahoma, and USC. And we have teams that I'm going to knock out that probably shouldn't be in there. Michigan State, Miami, NC State, Ole Miss, Oregon, Texas A&M, and I'm going to bump out Wake Forest as well. They did beat Vandy by 20 points last week, but I have a better squad to fit in my top 25. So first of all, Michigan State has played 2 MAC teams, including Akron, who might be one of the worst squads in the country. Michigan State really only had 2 good quarters against Western, if that, and Peyton Thorne has really not been in great shape, particularly against the Zips. Jaden Reed wasn't really involved against Western, and now he has a cut on his back that he suffered against Akron, so we'll see if he's back this week. We can talk defense and run game all day. The squad does lead the nation in sacks right now, But Peyton Thorne is completing 57% of his passes with a 4-3 touchdown to interception ratio. Miami has outscored Bethune Cookman and Southern Miss by a combined score of 100-20. Nothing to see there right now. NC State survived what I think will be a solid East Carolina team on the road, 21-20, after the Pirates missed an extra point and a field goal in the fourth, and they turned around and knocked out Charleston Southern 55-3 last week. Just not very impressive so far from NC State. Ole Miss started Jackson Dart at quarterback in an unimpressive win against Troy, then started Luke Altmaier against Central Arkansas, then put Dart back in when Altmaier got banged up. We don't know who's healthy, who's starting moving forward, but they have not looked super impressive very far against teams that they should be crushing. So here are my swaps. Mississippi State blew out Memphis and Arizona in Tucson. Arizona's looking like a much better ball club. Memphis might be a little bit up in the air, but Mississippi State, much better quality roster and looks like a team that should be in the top 25 right now. Are they one of the top 25 teams in the country? I don't know. They might actually be one of the better teams in the SEC West Division, I believe it is, with Alabama there. Certainly, I think a top 25 team right now. Oregon State crushed Boise State and then beat Fresno State on the last play of the game, but the Bulldogs are Mountain West favorites at this point. Oregon State has looked like a solid ball club, although they've played two Mountain West squads at this point. But the Beavers look like the real deal, and they should be competitive, if not towards the top of the Pac-12, and right there with them will be the Washington State Cougars, who won in Madison against Wisconsin. They did have to kind of pull through against Idaho, 24-17 in the opener. But again, they were breaking in that FCS level quarterback there. That's a new level jump up. So then to turn around and win in Madison the following week is one of the bigger wins right now in the country. Probably sneaks into the top 10, even with a number of the upsets that we saw this past week. Texas Tech shredded Murray State, as you're supposed to, by 50+ in the opener, and then beat Houston in double overtime this past week. We can debate whether that's a quality win later on down the road, but right now, it's a solid victory for the Texas Tech Red Raiders. Syracuse appropriately mauled UConn after the impressive Louisville blowout in Week 1. Syracuse could be a dangerous team in the wide-open ACC after probably Clemson at the top there. Marshall won in South Bend. Regardless of your Notre Dame feelings right now, that was a big victory, and they waxed Norfolk State 55-3 in the opener. They crushed an inferior team like they should have. And finally, Appalachian State. If we're going to be putting 1-1 teams in at this point, two quality opponents nearly beat North Carolina on the road, and then knocked off Texas A&M in a game that they pretty much controlled all the way through. So, this is my top 25 right now, give or take shifting a few teams around. Now, moving forward, I expect it to look a lot different, but this is just what I've cobbled together, sketching it out before recording here. Georgia 1, Alabama 2, Oklahoma 3, USC 4, Ohio State 5. Oklahoma, USC have looked great at this point. USC knocking off Stanford last week, having no trouble with the Cards on the road there. That's why I have it in that order. Arkansas, Michigan, Oklahoma State, BYU, Penn State rounding out the top 10 there. Penn State's offense could still be questionable moving forward, but they put together a solid drive on the road to knock off Purdue on the road in the opener, and then crushed Ohio last week. They did have their first 100-yard rusher as well. Freshman Nicholas Singleton put up 170 yards and 2 touchdowns in that victory last week. BYU obviously knocked off Baylor. Oklahoma State, close one against Central Michigan in the opener, but that looks like a solid team moving forward. Spencer Sanders finally looks like a fun quarterback to watch. Michigan, of course, we can't learn a whole lot from that. Their wins so far, that's why I've dropped them a few slots. Arkansas, a couple big games early. Cincinnati and South Carolina. So a couple nice wins in their cap. That's why I moved them up. Again, just scratching that out. So that's my top 10. Next, I have Clemson at the 11 slot. They did beat a Power 5 team, but it's going to be one of the worst in the country in Georgia Tech, and they didn't have that game in hand until into the second half. Kansas, Indiana, Rutgers, Illinois, Vanderbilt all have 2 wins apiece already as far as bottom level Power 5 schools are concerned. So Georgia Tech might be in the running for one of the worst. It's a little surprising. It took Clemson a while to get going in the opener there. And they beat Furman last week, but even that wasn't a particularly exciting victory. 12, 13, 14, 15 here. So I bunched Tennessee, Kentucky, and Florida all out of the same division in the SEC together here. Kentucky beating Florida on the road, obviously. Tennessee beating Pittsburgh and Ball State. One way via offense, one way via defense. And I just think Tennessee looks like a little bit better team right now. After that, I have Baylor, Utah, Texas, and Pitt. I could arguably place Baylor a little higher. I don't think that road loss to BYU was horrific, especially in multiple overtimes. And Texas obviously looks a lot better. Pittsburgh hung in there. 2 Power 5 games so far on this docket. Utah, I think, will look better, putting up 70 points on a much smaller scale Southern Utah team this past week after losing in the Swamp in the opener. And so to round it out here, Mississippi State in at 20, followed by Oregon State, Washington State, Marshall, Texas Tech, and Syracuse as those teams that have a few quality wins here and have looked good doing it. So that is my top 25 at this exact moment. Georgia, Alabama, Oklahoma, USC, Ohio State, Arkansas, Michigan, Oklahoma State, BYU, Penn State, Clemson, Tennessee, Kentucky, Florida, Baylor, Utah, Texas, Pittsburgh, Mississippi State, Oregon State, Washington State, Marshall, Texas Tech, and Syracuse. Friday night is when the games start. There's only a couple of them. So it's Friday, September 16th. 7:30, Louisville at 1-1 will be hosting Florida State at 2-0 on ESPN. And then at 8 o'clock, Wyoming at 2-1 will be hosting Air Force at 2-0 on the CBS Sports Network. Both of those are conference games, ACC and Mountain West. So Louisville, 2 games on the road to open the season. One, of course, against Syracuse, the other at Central Florida last week, where they won 20-14. It was a big victory. We haven't seen Florida State for 2 weeks. They took a bye after the LSU victory, and they played Duquesne in week 1. So the Seminoles will be looking to move to 3-0 with a big game here. Of course, this will be their second game on the road as well. They'll have Boston College next week, so they are lined up to possibly move to 4-0 here if a couple of games go their way. Jordan Travis, quarterback, will be well rested up, and it looks like that defensive front will be able to hopefully make some moves on the offensive line for Louisville. It's possible that we might have a real team here on the Florida State Seminole side, but again, we'll see. LSU was a mess their first lot out, so we'll see what Florida State is capable of doing on both sides of the ball. Louisville, again, still trying to get things going. Neither team, it looks like they're going to be really consistent in the ACC or capable of winning week after week here. It just is a coincidence, I guess, that Florida State looks lined up to get a few victories under their belt. But the same could be said for Louisville, who has South Florida next. Then they will play on the road at Boston College, then at a Virginia team who is supposed to be offensively gifted and struggled last week. So this could be a pivot game on running up a number of wins either way, but both teams very inconsistent. Cunningham still couldn't quite find his footing last week, even though they won in Central Florida. He was 14 for 29 for 201 yards, touchdown on the ground, 17 carries for 121 yards. It should be a competitive game, but whether we'll get any insight as to the direction that these schools are headed, who really knows? But the winner could be set up to rattle off a few games in a row. So this will be the toughest game that either one plays for a couple of weeks here. Now, Air Force, with the weakness that some of these other teams have shown in the Mountain West, could still set up to win the conference. Wyoming was thumped by Illinois just a couple of weeks ago, so they've rebounded nicely. But this is really Air Force's game. They've blown out Colorado 41-10, a Power 5 team, obviously. They did beat Northern Iowa 48-17. I'd expect the Falcons to roll here. Now, this Saturday the 17th, we have games pretty much at every single time slot, including 11 a.m., which is the first game, Wofford at Virginia Tech. But we do have noon games, 1 o'clock, 2, 2:30, 3, 3:34. So I'm going to try and break these up into digestible little segments here as our noon, afternoon, evening, and late night segments per usual. So the highlights here, starting in our typical fashion in the noon slate, is a little bit light. Big noon kickoff for Fox will be at the Nebraska hosting number 6 Oklahoma game. We'll see if there's any change there for Nebraska to say that the Huskers have any chance here against the Oklahoma team, which has looked solid on both sides of the ball under Brent Venables and his new tenure here. It would be a lie. Not to say there wouldn't perhaps be some renewed optimism with the removal of Scott Frost is possible for Nebraska. Of course, he did recruit a number of transfers in, so he had some pull there certainly. But after 2 horrible losses and even the North Dakota game that they won, it was, I believe, a tie game or close to it at half. It wasn't until the second half they were able to pull away. And of course, Georgia Southern and the Ireland game against Northwestern, the losses there, just a tough go in the Scott Frost tenure. So despite the transfers coming in and the recruits that he still had, the poor play has certainly got to come up. Can't be any worse with a new intern coach there and some different decisions being made with on-the-field play. Now, Oklahoma's beat UTEP 45-13 and Kent State 33-3. So we've learned nothing about the Sooners at all, but this is going to be a much more up-tempo game. Defenses looked solid. Not sure what they're going to put on the field, but Casey Thompson in, of course, at quarterback for Nebraska. He just hasn't looked that great coming in from Texas. Oklahoma, of course, familiar with him. Some of the players that are still there. So we'll see if Nebraska can get any kind of juice, but that would be really something if they could hang around in this game that is currently sitting at a 11.5 point spread for the Sooners. So not a blow up by any stretch of the imagination, but Oklahoma favored big time here. A few of the other games, South Carolina sitting at 1-1 will be hosting Georgia. Georgia, who smothered and shut out Samford, much lower level school, off the heels of the big Oregon win a couple weeks back. That's on ESPN. South Carolina got into a bit of a shootout with Arkansas that doesn't seem to have a particularly scary defense last week, but lost 45-30, I believe, was the final. But the Gamecocks just don't look like a great team. This should not be. This could be a shutout like it was last year. I don't expect to see much, even with it being a road game for Georgia. Indiana will be hosting Western Kentucky. It's a pair of undefeated teams. That's on ESPN 3. 2 teams that may not stay that way very long, obviously, with one having to come out with a victory here. But exciting story to see here so far. The Hilltoppers, a new quarterback in for that offense, which lost its offensive coordinator from the top scoring offense last year, but does have a new quarterback plugged in here, the transfer from West Florida, and that's Austin Reed, who has 551 yards, 7 touchdowns already, and a couple easier games over Austin Peay in Hawaii, although the Peay game got a little tight. So we'll see if they can pull an upset on the road or if the Hoosiers can surpass their win total from last year, which was only 2. 6.5 is the line here for Indiana. That is now on the Big Ten Network. It's been moved from ESPN 3. Kent State Long Island is on ESPN 3. A game not worth mentioning. And finally, Syracuse at 2-0 is hosting Purdue at 1-1. On ESPN 2. That should be an interesting game to see if the Qs can continue what's been a nice run for them. Of course, beating the tar out of the Louisville Cardinals 31-7 in the opener. They then rolled over UConn last week 48-14, but the Orange have looked solid so far. Garrett Schroeder is completing almost 80% of his passes, and he's rushed for 118 yards and a few touchdowns as well. Sean Tucker great running back as well, 212 yards, 2 touchdowns, a great duo there on the offensive side of the football. Purdue, of course, still has Alex O'Connell at quarterback. They fell apart late at the end of the Penn State game to lose the opener 35-31. They shut out Indiana State 56-0 last week. So this is arguably the best game on the slate at noon. But again, Western Kentucky at Indiana, that's in the Big Ten Network. Georgia at South Carolina on ESPN. Oklahoma at Nebraska on Fox. And Purdue at Syracuse on ESPN2. Those are all on the noon slate. To jog through the rest of the nooners, it's a pretty light slate. The 11 o'clock game is actually Wofford at Virginia Tech on the ACC network as the Hokies try to notch what is presumably an easy win on the schedule there under their belt before they hit ACC play. It's going to be a rough season for Grant Wells and the Hokies there. Youngstown State will visit number 9 Kentucky on the SEC network as the Wildcats try to continue the roll there to 3-0. Baylor will host Texas State, who's not a bad team out of that Sun Belt. Might be a little frisky there for a while on FS1. Abilene Christie will head to Missouri. That's the ESPN Plus, SECN Plus, SEC Plus networks. Army is 0-2. It's a little surprising, and they're hosting Villanova, who's 2-0, and a top 5 team at the FBS level. That's on the CBS Sports Network. Northwestern's hosting Southern Illinois on the Big Ten Network. Michigan will be hosting UConn on ABC, so that will, of course, be widely broadcasted. But that will be a start for J.J. McCarthy. You can't take anything from the 2 games early in this year that each guy started, J.J. McCarthy and McNamara, but it was pretty much decided prior that it was time. It was time for McCarthy to take a hold here. He's a more dynamic playmaker. He can do a little bit more with his legs, so it'll be great to see him against Iowa in a few weeks in a real matchup for the Wolverines. And finally, Miami of Ohio will be hosting Cincinnati on ESPNU. That can be a little tricky for the Bearcats. Fully expect them to win there, but Miami of Ohio, not the worst team out of the MAC. The 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock games, we have a weird spattering of not highly competitive matchups here and not high-profile teams. A lot of them will be on ESPN Plus to hit a couple of the higher-ranked teams, I suppose, here. West Virginia will be hosting Townsend as the Mountaineers hope to get their first victory of the year. Coastal Carolina will be hosting Buffalo as they hope to move to 3-0 as well, as they're quietly moving under the radar, beating up on some teams at their lesser competition there. UCLA still quietly moving on. They'll be playing South Alabama on the Pac-12 network. Rutgers will be hoping to move to 3-0 at Temple. That's at 2 o'clock. Ohio will be playing at Iowa State at 2 o'clock on ESPN Plus. And finally, Old Dominion will be playing at Virginia on the ACC network. That's after the Monarchs beat Virginia Tech 20-17. Then they turn around and lost to East Carolina 39-21. So they continue a tough stretch of games here, and they'll try to win at Virginia against the Cavaliers and Brennan Armstrong on the ACC network at 2 o'clock. That's the best game on that little slate there. So the afternoon, our actual afternoon slate, which I started with the 2:30 game, Notre Dame at 0-2 hosting California, who's 2-0 on NBC. I slated this as a top watch, but it's really only to see if Notre Dame is going to win or lose. Realistically, it's a flip to the fourth quarter kind of game. Obviously, Notre Dame forced to go with a quarterback change here due to injury. California has just not been a watchable or a decent football team in several years, and that's really not looking to change too much here. So I would recommend, quite frankly, not watching that football game with a couple of the other 3:30s that we have here coming up, but keep an eye on the score of that one, simply to see if the Irish can win a ball game here. 3 o'clock, Kansas State will be hosting Tulane, a pair of 2-0 teams on the Big 12 ESPN network as the Wildcats continue to slowly poke around here. And then the 3:30 slate, Oregon, who's made it back in the top 25 at 25, will be hosting this BYU Cougars team. That will be on Fox. And this is probably going to be the top watch of the slate here. And man, just a tough picks here. The real question for the Oregon Ducks is going to be, is Bo Nix a quality quarterback? Is he going to be able to move the ball? Or are we going to get slaughtered at home by a BYU team and a better quarterback here in Jaron Hall, who continues to beat the best teams put in front of him for a couple of years now, including Utah last year, Baylor so far this year? It's going to be a tough go, I think, for the Ducks, who have yet to prove a lot on the offensive side at the quarterback position and with defense just altogether. The Ducks did beat Eastern Washington 70-14 last week after falling, of course, in that horrible Georgia smothering where they didn't show up for more than a couple of plays. So it's just going to be a tough ask for them to rebound here against the Cougars, who could very well push them around. They might have the better quarterback. They might have the better personnel all the way up and down the field. And the line is currently 3.5 Oregon's way, and I can't tell you why that is. I expect it to be an enjoyable game. It could be a very fast-paced game if Oregon wants to push it, and it could slow down a little bit more the other way if BYU wants to do it that route. But I think the better team here is BYU, and I think that they will win it here on the road. Now, the other big game on the slate is number 22 Penn State heading to Auburn, and that's on CBS. Auburn has not played any quality opponents so far. Penn State's offense has struggled. We could see a quarterback change at some point. They have a true freshman on there, 6'5", big guy. We'll see if he replaces Sean Clifford at some point during the season. But Penn State finally rolled up 100 yards in a game, 176 behind their freshman running back, Nicholas Singleton, last week, who had 2 touchdowns on the ground and 176 yards. So it looks like he's going to be in prime position to try and take advantage of Auburn again here. Auburn's offense is terrible as well. This could be a rock fight, and it's going to be miserable. I think Penn State's secondary is really dangerous. We saw it against Alex O'Connell in the Purdue game. He's one of the better quarterbacks in the Big Ten, and I think this is going to be a miserable watch. But I think Penn State might actually have enough offense to pull ahead of Auburn here. So I actually like both the road teams here in 2 games that might be really, really gross, but will be prime time. Again, BYU at Oregon on Fox and Penn State at Auburn on CBS, with California at Notre Dame on NBC, tipping off an hour before either of those games. And that's your prime time afternoon slot right there. Now, College Game Day for ESPN has taken this opportunity to head to Boone, North Carolina for Appalachian State hosting Troy, a pair of 1-1 teams there. That game will be on ESPN Plus at 3:30, but that's where College Game Day has chosen to go out of all the options there. So that should tell you something. Minnesota, of course, 2-0, hasn't beaten anyone, and they'll be hosting Colorado at 0-2, who's looked miserable. That'll be on ESPN2. Wisconsin will look to rebound against New Mexico State. That's on the Big Ten Network. And Georgia Tech will be hosting Ole Miss. Of course, Georgia Tech 1-1 at this point. Ole Miss 2-0. We don't know who's starting at quarterback. They look like the better team on the road. That'll be on ABC. Just miserable games here. Alabama will be hosting Louisiana Monroe on the SEC network if you're feeling frisky there. Boise State will be hosting UT Martin on FS1. And Houston, what could be the best game in this afternoon window is the 4 o'clock ESPNU game. The Houston Cougars hosting Kansas. Houston, of course, playing 2 road games, although both were still in Texas. UTSA, which they won 37-35 in double overtime, and then the loss to Texas Tech, 33-30 in overtime or double overtime as well. So that group, the offense was supposed to be the calling card, and although they've hit the 30s in both games, they have not quite put up the highlight numbers that we've expected. Clayton Tune, the quarterback there, hitting less than 60% of his passes. But he might get some stiff competition again here. The Jayhawks 56-10 over Tennessee State, and then beating West Virginia 55-42, surviving that game last week. They may have a real quarterback here as well at Kansas. Jalen Daniels is completing 70% of his passes and has more touchdowns than interceptions, which is not always the case in Kansas football here. So that may actually be the game that's number 1 on my television, as the Jayhawks look to go to 3-0, or Houston might actually notch a bigger win here over a feisty Kansas Jayhawks team. Now, the evening slate has half a dozen games that I've singled out as solid, watchable games. LSU will be hosting Mississippi State on ESPN. The Tigers rebounded against Southern Georgia, I believe, last week and beat the tar out of them. Again, we've learned nothing from LSU beating a nobody. And Mississippi State has looked like a swell football team, knocking off Arizona 39-17 last week in the desert and Memphis 49-23 the week previous. And they are 2-point favorites on the road here, and I think that looks great. I expect them to win unless LSU's really figured something out, but that'll be a big divisional game there as LSU continues to try and put the pieces together to become a competitive football team. Mississippi State will be throwing the ball all over the yard. It just looks like a good team. This just looks like a good team because Arizona looks like it rebounded a bit after a solid week 1 win, despite some sloppiness coming in and starting the season, but a rough 3-touchdown loss at home to a good Mississippi State Bulldog team. Fox will have number 3 Ohio State hosting Toledo at 7 o'clock. Now, I have this singled out only because maybe Toledo can hang for a little bit. I really like their quarterback. He should be a good time if he can move the ball a little bit, which I think he will against this defense that allowed Arkansas State to move the ball a little bit last week, and that's a Daquan Finn, I believe how it's pronounced, and he is a dual threat. He might be almost more of a, I hate to say this, but a running back type than a true thrower, certainly a threat with his legs, so that could be a fun time. And a little scary for Ohio State if he's able to put some dent in that armor with other teams coming up that may have more threatening guys at the quarterback position. So I have that kind of highlighted here on my list. Not that I expect the Rockets to go in and win that football game. Number 16, NC State. They'll be hosting Texas Tech, a threatening Red Raiders team. Both of these squads 2-0 at this point. That'll be on ESPN2. NC State trying to rebound after not showing much the first 2 weeks, beating a nobody Charleston Southern last week and surviving East Carolina on the road the week previous. They will have Clemson next week. So this is, can't slip up here against a Texas Tech team, which has notched a couple of good victories right off the bat here. They beat Houston in double overtime last week, as we just touched on a second ago, and they beat Murray State by $1 billion the week before. But this is a squad that's had a little bit of injury issues with the quarterback position. I'm not actually sure who's going to start this game, but they certainly have some competent pieces here. I don't have much else to say on this game. I haven't watched a lot of Texas Tech so far this year, but I expect them to certainly challenge. They've looked like a solid team. The Big 12 doesn't seem to have a lot of, air quotes, bad football teams so far, or at all, with Kansas winning, Texas Tech bringing up the rear, and even West Virginia in 2 losses here. So I expect them to certainly challenge NC State, especially if they're looking ahead to the road trip to Death Valley next week. Now at 7:30, we have Maryland hosting SMU and Michigan State heading towards Washington. So let's tackle Maryland first. They're on FS1 hosting SMU. SMU's offense, they of course lost their head coach as he moved over to TCU to take on a Power 5 job there, but they're still able to keep the offense humming so far. They beat North Texas 48-10 and Lamar 45-16, so we haven't seen much so far, but the offense seems to be doing pretty okay. Tanner Mordekel has a 65% completion percentage and 7 touchdowns. He's one of 10 quarterbacks averaging over 10 yards per attempt so far, and we'll get to another one in just a moment. But Maryland beat Buffalo, beat Charlotte, and this should be a fireworks show. Tagaloa, 78% completion percentage as a quarterback for the Terrapins there, brother of Tua of the Miami Dolphins in the NFL, 681 yards. So it's going to be 2 quarterbacks flinging the ball back and forth is basically what this is going to be here. Yes, 2 guys averaging over 10 yards per attempt. And Maryland favored by a small margin in this one right now, 3.5, but that's on FS1 at 7:30. Now another guy averaging over 10 yards per completion, plays for a surprising team, and that is in Washington, as Michael Penix Jr. has transferred out of Indiana to that squad, and they're putting up a whole boatload of points through 2 games so far for a team that really struggled with offense last year, lost to Montana early on, and was just surprisingly atrocious to the point where making a bowl game this year was going to be a major step up. That's just basically unheard of. They're supposed to be a dark horse to compete for the Pac-12 last year, and they were so horrific that it impacted our expectations not only for last year but this year as well. That just making a bowl game this year would be a step up from how last year, going 4-8 and firing the entire coaching staff, was going to go. It's very rare that you see something where you're just like, man, this season went so far south that it's going to affect our expectations for the next 2 years. That's just wild to me. But anyways, Michael Penix is doing a great job there. They flamed Portland State last week. They put up 70 on them. And the week previous, they knocked out someone else who I don't have in front of me at the moment. But he's looking sharp. In Michigan State, I went on a rant earlier. Haven't looked sharp in the 2 teams that they should have beat by a lot more at this point. So will their passing game keep up? Who knows? Will the run game be enough on that defense? And will they put pressure on Michael Penix to have to throw the ball there? Spartans are also favored on the road by 3.5, and that's kind of baffling to me. So the Huskies beat Kent State 45-20 in Portland 52-6. But Spartans could have a tough time going across the country for a surprisingly offensively gifted Washington squad there. Finally, at 8 o'clock, I have Texas, who's now ranked 21st at 1-1, hosting UTSA, who's also ranked 1-1. Unfortunately, that's on the Longhorns network, which is going to be difficult to view. Texas is 12.5-point favorites. I'm not sure how I feel about that. If it's too high, it's too low. I think Frank Harris, the UTSA quarterback, might be the best one on the field after Card was enough for Texas last week, but not phenomenal. The Roadrunners did beat Army 41-38 last week on the road. Not a bad Army squad. And they lost, of course, in overtime to Houston 37-35 in the opener. Frank Harris, returning off a great season last year, completing 68% of his passes and is a threat on the ground as well. It wouldn't necessarily be a statement win on a casual fan level for Texas, but I think it would hold a lot of water for a bigger win for those that really pay attention to college football and know the caliber of team that UTSA is, coming off that heartbreaking Alabama loss and rolling with your backup quarterback, even though he's been in the quarterback competition for the past 2 years, but losing both times. But Hudson Card being able to prepare for this game and having this group at home, I think would be a solid win if he could win by a couple scores here and cover that 12.5 spread. Some other games of note in the evening slate here. Number 19, Wake Forest will be hosting Liberty. Both teams still undefeated. That'll be on the ACC network. Wake Forest, of course, has Sam Hartman back as he hopes to continue his role here. They looked good beating Vanderbilt, who's been surprisingly productive last week. They're favored by 16.5 here. They should probably cover, I would think. Washington State, high off the Madison win. Wisconsin victory will be hosting Colorado State, who's having a rough year. That'll be on the Pac-12 network. Marshall will be heading to Bowling Green right now. That is on the NFL network. Interesting. Okay, well, the Marshall Thundering Herd will be playing Bowling Green on the NFL network for those interested. 6 o'clock, we'll have East Carolina hosting Campbell. Duke will be hosting North Carolina A&T. Those are both on the ESPN network. Some of the higher-ranking teams will be taking on squads they will presumably be beating handily, right? Number 8, Oklahoma State will be hosting Arkansas Pine Bluff on the ESPN Plus network. Number 15, Tennessee will be hosting this miserable Akron team, ESPN Plus as well. And number 10, Arkansas will be hosting Missouri State. And that is a squad that is currently ranked number 6 at the FCS level. And that Razorback defense didn't look so great, giving up a lot of points to South Carolina last week. So that is one to maybe keep a little tag on. That's on ESPN Plus as well. Florida will be hosting South Florida on the SEC network. I don't expect that to be competitive, but if South Florida is able to throw Anthony Richardson for a loop, they're going to be at risk of losing anytime that offense can't really go. But Florida's defense is a real threat, and they might stifle the Bulls on the other end as well. Pittsburgh's actually traveling to Kalamazoo to play Western Michigan. That'll be on ESPNU. Iowa's hosting Nevada in what's going to be an atrocious game on the Big Ten Network. Clemson will be hosting Louisiana on the ACC Network. And 8 o'clock, we'll have Oregon State hosting Montana State, who's fourth on the FCS level polls this week on the Pac-12 Network. That would be a tough game for the Beavers to lose, not that I expect them to, but that could be a feisty game for them as well. Finally, it's your late night, great night slate. At 9 o'clock, we will have number 24, Texas A&M, hosting number 13, Miami. The Hurricanes have done nothing so far, smashing inferior competition, so we'll have to see how good this team really is and what kind of weaknesses they're having, because it's not quite a national championship team. Looks like they may have a few flaws, but man, Texas A&M looks atrocious right now. So will the Miami Hurricanes be able to win in Texas? That will be on ESPN. Perhaps the Aggies make a quarterback change, but the Hurricanes certainly look like they could go in there and beat the Aggies. Texas A&M is still favored by 5.5 right now with a 44.5 over-under. And even with a flawed Miami team, it just seems hard to see Texas A&M putting up a whole lot of points in this one. At 10 o'clock, number 14, Utah will be hosting San Diego State on ESPN2. Again, San Diego State really fell apart against Arizona a couple weeks back, and then they rebounded by beating Idaho State 38-7. So Utah beat Southern Utah last week. This is currently a 21-point line. It's possible it'll be a little bit closer if San Diego State proves that they're a decent squad. They really had a tough go in week 1 against Arizona. That was really a sloppy ball game. So perhaps they will stay within the 21 points here, although I expect Utah to be the better ball team here. But we have another game with an offensively struggling team in San Diego State. Now, 10:30, we will not have that problem, finally. Number 7, USC is hosting Fresno State on Fox. Fresno State is one of the few teams in the country that is not forced to turnover, yet they are a very feisty opponent to take down. They did lose to the Beavers at the very end of the game last week. Prior to that, they had ran it up on Cal Poly, but they have one of the best quarterbacks, I'm not going to say in the country. They have a really good quarterback in Jake Haener. There's a lot of good quarterbacks nationally, but he's got 737 yards, almost a 75% completion percentage so far, and he's very, very capable. And so is Caleb Williams on the other side for USC. As we know, they had no problem with Stanford last week, and this is a very fun team to watch in the Trojans. And, Fresno State's not too bad either. So this right here is what we all may need after a day of what may not have a lot of upsets or a lot of offense. This would be a great little nightcap. I am a little surprised that USC is only favored by 12 at home. I would think that they would be able to pull it out by a couple scores pretty soundly, even if this is a great back and forth for a while. The over-under 75 points, but really excited for this one. At 11 o'clock, Arizona, who currently sits at 1-1 and is tied for the same number of victories as they had last year, they will be playing the mighty North Dakota State Bison, winner of however many national championships, 9 of the last 10, I believe, at the FCS level. And this should be a good ball game. Currently, the Bison's quarterback is a man by the name of Cam Miller. He doesn't even have a photo on ESPN right now, which is terribly unfortunate. He would have ranked second at the FCS level nationally in passing efficiency last year. He was just short of the minimum passing attempts qualified to fall in the rankings, but he was good. He's a good player. So expect the Bison to certainly give the Wildcats everything they can handle. They were blown out last week, unfortunately, by the Mississippi State Bulldogs, but they're still looking a lot better than they did last year. So that's a fun 11 o'clocker on FS1. A couple more to end the slate, and that's Arizona State hosting Eastern Michigan at 11 o'clock on the Pac-12 network, as the Sun Devils hope to rebound from the loss to Oklahoma State last week. And Duquesne will be heading to the islands and playing Hawaii at 11:59. The Rainbow Warriors at this point, who I've watched an awful lot of between week 0 and the Michigan game and everything else, they've been outscored 168-37 so far this season. But maybe, just maybe, they'll pick up a W this upcoming week, Saturday, heading into Sunday. So let's hit our categories here, our top watches, and it was a little bit tricky this week with a lot of kind of middling games and not a lot of higher end material, I would say. So our weekday watch, we only had 2 choices. So Florida State at Louisville on Friday at 7:30 on ESPN is your top weekday watch, and it's a solid one. Cunningham still hasn't really stepped up for Louisville this year, but he's at home for the first time. Florida State has had 2 weeks off and will be coming in trying to move to 3-0. So we will see here between the Seminoles and the Cardinals. That's the top weekday watch. Now your top must-watch game is a little tricky here. I'm going to go with a 9 o'clock game, number 13 Miami at number 24 Texas A&M on ESPN. The other game I had on the slate was Oregon at BYU. That was certainly in the running, and maybe that would have been the better pick. But I think this Miami-Texas A&M game is so critical. If Miami can win on the game here and go into the ACC with a conference play with a full head of steam, they could potentially go undefeated and have a shot at the playoffs. That's certainly on the schedule, on the ballot for them. They do not play Clemson in the regular season lineup, so they're going to be favored in their division. Now, Texas A&M losing at home would be another game, would just be devastating, and to start 1-2 heading into SEC play would just be a horrific way to start for the Aggies. Now a win over a top 15 team, and all of a sudden they're climbing back up the polls. Now how that would come about, the circumstances would be interesting, and then what would be the narrative around Miami? How would they look? I just think that's a very intriguing matchup. Oregon, BYU, with BYU being an independent, although the schedule is very difficult. USC still coming up. Notre Dame still coming up in Las Vegas in a neutral site game as well. But that's still a great game. It's hard to say either way. I just think BYU is going to go in there and not roll, but simply look like the better football team. So I'm going to go with Miami over Texas A&M. If you have to sit down and pick one game, it's the 9 o'clock ESPN game there, Miami at Texas A&M. My audible is South Florida at number 18 Florida. That's the 7:30 SEC network game. If that whole evening time slot games kind of goes to crap, Toledo's down a bazillion to Ohio State. NC State, Texas Tech is kind of uninteresting. Washington, Michigan State, if that's leaning one way, Texas, you can't even watch because they're on the Longhorn Network. Mississippi State is making a mess of LSU. Then flip over and see how Anthony Richardson is doing after a horrific performance last week, and see if he is able to run it up against South Florida here, how he looks passing the ball. He can certainly do that, but can he read defenses, quite frankly? And is he going to be scatterbacking, making his way down the field, moving those feet? So Florida hosting South Florida at 7:30 in the SEC network, and that evening time slot is certainly an audible if you wish to opt out of all those other games. Underrated. I spent time on this already. That's Houston hosting Kansas at 4 o'clock in that afternoon slate on ESPNU. Again, that may end up being the best game out of all of them in the afternoon time slot. Check in. 3:30, number 20, Ole Miss at Georgia Tech on ABC. A lot of rough narrative around Ole Miss right now. Quarterback questions, unimpressive wins so far in a dicey division, although LSU is having problems. Auburn's having problems. Mississippi State is looking good. Texas A&M is having problems. So if Ole Miss can maybe right the ship, maybe they're the third or fourth best team in there. Arkansas is playing in the same division. Who really knows? But they're playing at Georgia Tech. It's at least a non-conference matchup between a couple Power 5 teams. And again, I like Sims, the quarterback for Georgia Tech, and there's very few games that they're going to have an opportunity to win this season. This could be at least an intriguing matchup, even if neither team is going to be playing for a national championship. And that'll be on ABC, so everyone will get to watch it. Small screen, a game between two non-Power 5 teams, and the pickings are kind of slim this week, but I went with the nooner since that's such a weak slate. I'm going with Army, a solid squad, but winless at this point, hosting Villanova, a powerful FCS team, top 5 ranked. That's on the CBS Sports Network. They'll have an opportunity to upset Army on the road there, and that might not be too bad of a ball game in a weak noon slate. Late night snack, of course, it's going to be Fresno State at USC, the 10:30 Fox game, although that's where all the great games are going to be packed in, so you're going to be channel flipping around for your late night snack game. But Fresno State, USC should not be lacking for offense on a day that, as a whole, in totality, is going to be really questionable on that side of the ball. So there are your top watch categories for this week. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy your college football for week 3.
All my blessings, 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 all my blessings.
I need my blessings every penny, daily counting every single one.